tasks for Friday. 1. Interrogate Annabelle in first period. Jade. 2. Drew. 3. Everett. 4. Meet E and D for lunch at the market to review progress. She turned to Everett and Drew as she wrote, "What can you guys do tomorrow?" "I've got Jay and Ernest in health science," Drew said. "It was his favorite class because he loved to listen to Sister Claire talk about abstinence." "I'll find Francis," Everett stretched as he got up. She could see his ribs under his t-shirt. Jade filled in their assignments in the notebook as they left. "See ya," she called out. Jade watched her associates go down the dark walk. Drew and Everett were the best investigators in Bonaparte, or maybe the world for that matter. Jade had handpicked them for their remarkable abilities and their specialties. Everett and Drew each got 25% of what Jade Hill and Associates took in for every case. They were worth it. Jade was the brains. Everett was the only son of one of Bonaparte's most important black families. He had 6 sisters, all of whom left Bonaparte and were now living in other parts of Mississippi, married, going to college, or just hanging out somewhere. Everett was the youngest of the Swifts. He was skinny and looked skinnier because he wore tight jeans and t-shirts he was always just growing out of. He never wore socks. He wore his hair buzz cut and had big ears sticking out from the sides of his nicely shaped head. He was a good-looking boy, polite to a fault. He could yes ma'am and no sir his way out of anything. He was their politician. Drew was a wannabe hood, old style. He had a mop of hair, wore a black leather jacket over his white t-shirt, jeans rolled at the bottom, biker boots, and when not in school always had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He never smoked it. If it wasn't in his mouth, it was behind his ear. He had a James Dean look about him. Drew lived with his great-aunt in a government-issued trailer on the south side of town. She claimed she had money, but she told everyone she kept it buried and lived off the state. Since the Civil War, one male from each generation of Drew's family had died in service to his country, so now Miss Joseph believed the government owed her. She'd never married. Drew was her nephew's son. The story was that Drew's dad had drowned Drew's mother and then himself. Their bodies had never been found. That case, like Jade's mother's, was in the agency filing cabinet. The drawer was marked unsolved. Drew was Jade Hill and Associates' breaking and entering artist. Jade Hill and Associates was what Jade did for fun, to make a bit of spending money and to get better at uncovering things that people wanted to hide. She figured that if she got good enough, one day she'd learn what had happened to her mother. Jade had a secret things of I want to do before I'm 15 list, and find out what happened to her mother was item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, and item 5. Right now, there were no other items on her list. According to her father, when Jade was 3, her mother had floated away. This was what her father had told her from the time she was a tiny kid. No story, no details, just a statement. All she knew about her mother was that her family named their daughters after jewels or precious stones. Jade's mother's name had been Opal. Her grandmother had been Pearl. Pearl had sisters named Ruby and Crystal. She knew nothing else about her mother, and if she had met any of her mother's family, she couldn't remember. No amount of cajoling could ever get August to divulge any details about what had happened to her mother. Mostly he just said, "Jade, let it be. Some things you just have to leave be." As an investigator, Jade knew that this silence meant he was hiding something. Her grandfather, who had lived with them till he had to go to the old folks' home, was no help either. He had dementia, and he could tell her nothing that made sense. But even when he'd lived with them, he'd been as evasive as August. She had no other relatives that she knew, so for now, she was stuck. Obviously, no one was ready to tell her what had happened. By the time she was 7, Jade had stopped asking August what had happened to her mother, because she'd figured out that he was never going to tell her the truth. Maybe the real story was too hard for him to retell, or maybe there was something to hide. Jade just decided to wait till she found out on her own. It was getting cool enough now to sleep with the doors closed. Doors were not locked in this part of town. which had led to 2 burglaries in the month of September. Constable Corny Brayard had called a town meeting after the second burglary, reminding the citizens that the world was changing and everyone had to be more vigilant, maybe less trusting. The townspeople had looked around uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to stop trusting their neighbors. Even after Constable Brayard's advice, August had not locked their doors. There had never been a reason to think bad guys were out there trying to get into their house. Jade didn't think she was afraid of anything. There were things she didn't like. She didn't like the dark space under the veranda, the attic, the unused dusty rooms in their huge house, the door on the back wall of her closet so swollen from years of damp that she'd never been able to open it. She definitely did not like snakes. Those were the things that got to Jade, but she never let her imagination have too long a leash. Whenever something didn't seem right, she tried to figure it out logically, which was what she'd learned from her dad. Logic and facts could explain almost everything. But logic and facts didn't work on Jade's phobia about snakes. Just to prove to herself that she was not a wimp, she thought about how bloated Mrs. Stokes' body would be 2 weeks under the water. Bonaparte averaged 6 floaters a year. That's the way the police referred to bodies pulled out of the river. They were as inevitable as the tides. Jade suddenly had an odd thought. Floater? Her mother had floated away? "Good night, August," she called to him as she climbed up the wide staircase, forcing herself not to think about floating. There were newspaper pictures from the old days when their mansion had been a showplace, and someone, she didn't know who, had framed some of the stories and hung them on the walls of the stairway, turning it into a historical gallery. Back then, young women glided down in huge hoop skirts to be escorted out to the street to waiting carriages. Then they were swept away to a cotillion or some other such function. Now the rails wobbled and the stairs creaked. Under the stairs was a great storage area full of steamer trunks and moldering boxes with curled yellow labels. Under the stairs was also what Jade considered to be the treasure of their house, a very large painting of her mother. Jade had found it when she was 5. It was layered in years of dust. Jade, of course, had asked her father to help her carry it up to her room, but August had unrelentingly said no. He'd said the painting had to stay where it was. So Jade had covered it with a sheet to try to protect it. Whenever her mother's face started to fade in her memory, she went back to the darkness, raised the sheet, and looked into her mother's eyes. In the painting, her mother wore the white dress. In the painting, she had no feet. End of chapter 1.